It sounds a little strange for me to say it's nice to be with you because I'm with you most weeks, but it's nice to be with you. The book of Job is a tough book. It's one of the longest books in the Bible, one of the couple longest books in the Old Testament. And a lot of the book, even though its theme, which really has to do with the problem of pain and suffering and why God allows it in our lives, even though the theme is one that grabs us, if you've ever tried to read through the book of Job without any context, it gets very repetitive very fast. And part of this is because Job wasn't written as a book of history, and it wasn't written as even a story. So it's not like 1st and 2nd Kings. It's not like Ezra or even the book of Esther. Most of the book, from chapter 3 all the way through until partway through the last chapter, is poetry. And you don't realize that when you're reading a lot of English translations. So the book probably isn't, although sometimes we treat Job as a historical figure, probably the point isn't so much to say there was this person, Job, way back there at some point, and this is what happened to him. Probably the point is more like Plato's dialogues. We set up a story, a case study, and the author of Job is saying, imagine someone like this who suffers. Now let's listen to what he and his friends have to say about it. And most of the book is relating those conversations between Job and initially 3 and then a 4th of his friends. And finally, God steps into the conversation toward the end. I'm not going to talk a lot about those conversations today. My task is to talk about what's often referred to as the frame story. Because wrapped around those dialogues is this little sort of context story. We don't know exactly when Job was written. The story itself doesn't provide any historical clues or references. That's another indication that the point isn't about some man Job back there, but that the point is about the reflections that are going on, because he seems to be kind of an everyman. But it is interesting both to look at the language that's used in Job. Hebrew scholars have looked at it, and also to look at the themes and the way the themes in Job relate to other books like Ecclesiastes. And when we look at those things, it seems like Job was written around the same time as the book of Esther. So Israel has gone into exile, as Ken and Kim reminded us last week, in Babylon. And then in Babylon, the prophets promised the people of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, that God would restore them. That if they were faithful and waited, that God would bring them back to the land. And in fact, that happened. So the Babylonians, almost overnight, were conquered by the Persians. And the Persians had a totally different policy on what to do with their client peoples that they had conquered. And so the Persians say, you don't have to stay here in Babylon, you Jews, you can go home. Now, probably the majority of the Jews, the Judeans, decided to stay in Babylon. Why? Because now we're talking about the grandchildren, in many cases, of the people who had been deported. They had lives, they had families in exile. But a few families began to trickle back to Jerusalem. And once they got home, what struck them very quickly seems to have been a profound disillusionment, because the prophets had promised amazing things when they returned, and they didn't see it. The prophets' words had been fulfilled insofar as they were back in the land again. But when they got back, they were a tiny handful of people camping in the ruins of what had been a big, wealthy city. They were poor. They were having trouble just feeding themselves. Judea was no longer what we would think of as even a tiny country. It was really just these few families camped in the ruins of Jerusalem, farming some of the slopes of the ridges around the city, and that was it. Initially, they didn't have a city wall, and some of the biblical authors refer to jackals and wild animals hunting and running around within what used to be the city limits. Initially, they don't even have a temple. Well, things begin to improve a little bit, and Nehemiah comes back and brings some resources and some coordination and gets the holes in the city wall filled in. So now at least they can defend themselves from all of the hostile neighbors around them who are just rubbing their hands gleefully, waiting until they can pounce and take over this land that the Judeans have occupied. And Ezra shows up, and he reintroduces them to the book of the law, reads the book of the law out to the people, and they dedicate themselves freshly to keeping God's commands. And the people even scrape together enough out of their poverty to build a little temple. But still, things in the 5th century BC and into the 4th century BC were profoundly disappointing. The temple that they build is a hut compared to their memory of Solomon's temple. It has no gold, it has no precious gems decorating anything. In terms of its floor area, it's tiny. And the people still remain desperately poor, on the verge of starvation. They're nothing like the kingdom that their great-grandparents knew, and certainly nothing like the kingdom flourishing with peace that the prophets had predicted. So it's natural, I think, that before too long, the Judean people who are camped out in Jerusalem start asking, why? Why is it like this? We're doing all the right things. God, we're doing what you asked us to do. And compared to Israel prior to the exile to Babylon, they really were. There's no evidence of idolatry or worship of pagan gods or anything like that after their return from exile. And yet, they were poorer than their pagan neighbors. They were suffering and, in many cases, starving when their neighbors who didn't pay any attention to God's law at all were wealthy and were just waiting to snatch them up. And so the book of Job, along with other books like the book of Ecclesiastes, tries to make sense of this. And Job's approach is for the author to say, yeah, it really does seem like things are not fair. It really does seem like God is not doing right by us. So let's think about a situation where things are really unfair. You have been doing your best to be faithful to God, and you've been doing a pretty good job of it. Well, imagine Job, who is perfectly blameless, perfectly righteous. We're told at the beginning of the book that there is no blemish in him. He's like an animal or a young sheep that has no birth defects. There's nothing on his character that isn't right. And we're told he's upright. He's walking a straight path. And he's been rewarded for that. God has blessed him. And at the beginning of the book, in this frame story, setting up the context, we're told that Job has 7,000, I've got to get this right, it's 7,000 sheep and 3,000 cattle. And these are probably symbolic numbers. 7 is a number of perfection or completeness. 3 is a number associated with God. And so the idea is these are divine gifts from God, and they're perfect, they're complete. He has ideal wealth, because of course, in the ancient world where there aren't banks and there isn't very good solid currency, your primary form of wealth is animals. Not only is he wealthy in material terms with all of this, but he has the ideal family. So he has 7 sons to care for him and his wife in their old age, to run their estates, to administer their affairs, so that he doesn't have to worry about what's going to happen. He has 3 daughters. Notice again the numbers 7 and 3. Again, these are gifts from God. And his children get along, perhaps most miraculously. So we're told that his children get together at one another's houses to have banquets, and they eat and drink together. And what's striking early on here to me is that Job doesn't get complacent. So he's not sort of turned by all of the wealth and all of the prosperity. Because after he and his children have one of these banquets, he gets up early in the morning before all of the other kids are up. Maybe they're still sleeping off whatever they drank the night before. And he offers sacrifice for all of his children in case they might have accidentally sinned. So we have a picture here of, in many ways, the perfect man. The author calls him the greatest man of the East. And we don't know where the land of Uz was. We don't know where in the East we're talking about. He's just this ideal human being. But it doesn't stay that way. And Job suddenly loses everything. Overnight, all of his livestock is killed, meaning he is destitute. His children are all killed. His house collapses. It's like the ultimate country song. And in the midst of this, what's Job's reaction? Well, he doesn't scream and rage against God. He says at the end of chapter 1, okay, God, you give and you take away. I came into this life naked, and I'll leave it naked. At least I've got my health. And then we have a second round of disaster. And now it's not just his possessions and his family that are lost, but now he loses his health. And he's covered from head to toe with open, weeping sores. Any of you who have ever had an ulcer or had a second or third degree burn or anything like that, imagine that kind of pain all over your body. And he still doesn't rage against God. What does he do? He can't do anything else, so he just sits down in the dust. And pottery was the sort of the cheapest thing that was around. And if you go to any ancient archaeological sites, all over the ground you see broken bits of pottery because pots were kind of disposable. So he finds a little chunk of broken pottery and he just starts scraping his skin, trying to get some kind of comfort. And he sits. He's come to the end of his rope, but all he can do is wait. Well, that's the context in which his 3 friends, and then later a 4th, are going to join him. And they're going to have this conversation about the whole question of why he's in this situation. And I need to leave some things for Ken and Kim and Ken and Phil to say over the next 2 weeks, so I'm not going to talk about those conversations yet. But I want to think about that frame story. What is the author trying to say by showing us this context for Job's suffering? Well, one of the things that the author does is tries to address our question, why? Why is this happening to him? And he tries to address that question by pulling back the curtain on the heavens and letting us see into God's heavenly court. He imagines God as a sort of heavenly king with his court that a king would have. And God is seated on the throne, and all of God's ministers are coming in and giving reports, angelic servants. And one of those servants comes in. And in many of our translations, this servant is called Satan. And there's a long tradition of identifying this servant with the chief fallen angel, Satan. But at this period in Israel's history, that name wasn't used yet, probably, for the chief fallen angel. There were other names that were being used around this time. And this seems to be a title rather than a name, because we're told he's the Satan. And Satan actually is a regular noun in Hebrew. It means the accuser. So a lot of people think that rather than this being Satan, why is he allowed to come into the heavenly court? Why is he allowed to come into God's presence? Why is he allowed to go and influence Job's life? Because this is actually a servant of God's, an angel of God's, who acts like his crown prosecutor. This is the angel whose job it is to go around the cosmos, looking at people's lives and seeing whether they measure up. And then coming back to God and reporting on that. And he says, all right, God, you're right. Job, I can't find anything wrong with him. But I think he only serves you because it pays. What if you take it all away? And so God says, all right, I have enough confidence in Job and his faithfulness that I'll let you take it all away, and you'll see that Job stands up. And so God is proved right. And then the Satan comes back and says, yeah, but you still didn't let me touch Job's physical body. If you take away his health, I bet you he's not going to stand up. And God says, okay, I'll prove to you that Job is faithful. I'll let you touch his body, which is when Job receives the sores all over his body. Now, what's the point of this? Is this supposed to explain suffering? Are we supposed to think that if we see people in Job's situation, where their suffering and their pain seems to be deeply unfair, that we should say, oh, God's just testing them? I don't think so. I think what the author is doing is trying to say, we don't see the whole picture. So Job never gets to see what we see in the heavenly court in chapters 1 and 2. At the end of the book, God restores Job once he's proved faithful and gives him back all of his blessings and more. I always wonder how that works with children, but Job, even at the end, doesn't ever find out why. And so the author, I think, is in part saying to his fellow Israelites, even if you can't see any order or reason to what's happening to you, and even if you never, ever are able to see that, there is a reason. There is some bigger picture in which what is happening to you makes sense. And the frame story really is an invitation to the audience to exercise faith in that. An invitation to believe that even though it doesn't seem like there's any possible way in which what's happening could be fair. That there is a bigger picture that we can't see, and maybe a bigger picture that as created beings we're not even able to understand. But the invitation is, will we believe, make a choice to believe that that bigger picture is there? That's what Job does. And that's what shifts us from our question, why is this happening, to God's question in the situation. God's question is different. God's question is, will you curse God when you suffer? If you look carefully through chapters 1 and 2, you'll notice all of these references to cursing God. What sin is Job worried about that his children might do? They might curse God in their hearts. What does his wife tell him to do when he's afflicted with all these sores? Curse God. What does cursing God mean in this situation? It means saying to God, I'm passing judgment on you. It means saying to God, I see enough of the big picture to know, God, that you are my enemy, not my friend. And turning his back on God. That would be to curse God, and that's what Job refuses to do. Now, that doesn't mean he isn't upset. That doesn't mean he doesn't despair. And we're going to see through the body of the book that he goes through the depths of profound black despair. This is not a nice, friendly book. So cursing God is not the same as lament. Through the Psalms, we're taught by example how to lament, how to say, God, this is horrible. God, this is not what you promised for us. God, come and help us because we don't know how to stand up here. That's not cursing God. It's not even cursing God to go out to the beach on a cold morning where nobody's around and yell at the top of your lungs at God because you don't know what else to do. That's not cursing God. Cursing God is to give up on him. Cursing God is to stop talking to him because we've decided he's not going to do anything. He's not our friend. He's not our father. He's our enemy. That would be to curse God. And that's what Job doesn't do. I'm not under any illusions that that's an easy thing. I watched my mother over 20-odd years suffer with cycles of profound mental illness that led to a kind of suffering over the years in her that was horrible because there was no pain reliever for it, And sitting with her and watching her year after year, watching her get a little bit better, start to pull her life together, and then get the call that she was in the hospital again. That was, well, sometimes I don't think there are words for what that was. This isn't easy, and there were definitely times, and still are times, when it's really tempting to say, not just that I don't understand, but that there's no possible way that was fair. There's no possible way that God was doing right by her. But the invitation of this frame story in Job to us, to me, is to stick with God. For me to say, even though I can't make any sense of what my mother had to go through, I'll choose to believe that there's a bigger picture that I can't see. And even if I never see it, I choose to believe that God is going to do right by me and that God is going to do right by her. And even if all I can do is sit in the dust, I will sit in the dust and wait for God. Now, that's not where Job ends. And we're going to see more over the next couple of weeks about our struggle to try and make sense of all of this. But I think, as difficult as it is, Job's message is really a message of hope. An invitation to hope when it feels like hope is impossible. This is kind of a funny sermon to preach on Thanksgiving. But, I think maybe it's appropriate because sometimes we receive amazing, miraculous gifts from God and at the same time are suffering profoundly. And sometimes Thanksgiving is particularly hard for some of us because we feel like whatever we have to be thankful for is overshadowed by the pain. So at Thanksgiving, as we go back and eat ham or turkey or whatever we're going to eat, frozen lasagna, Job's invitation to us today and this week is to stick with God. To stick with God. Even if all we can do right now is sit in the dust. And then to let others come and sit with us. Amen.